Welcome to another episode of In Conversation With. This is a series of discussions between people who hold advanced degrees in the life sciences about their careers and career journeys. My name is Chris Heinen. I am a professor of medicine at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine and the director of postdoctoral affairs at UConn Health. I am also a former member of the ASBMB Education and Professional Development Committee, from which this podcast was born. And we're excited today to continue our series of conversations about the vast array of careers available for grad students and postdocs in the life sciences. Hey, Chandrima.
Hi, Chris. I'm Chandrima Mujumdar, and I'm a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm a current member of the ASBMB Education Professional Development Committee, and I'm excited to welcome our guest for today's episode, Dr. Sarah Smaga. Sarah has had a fascinating journey in the life sciences, going from being a structural biologist to the managing director of an NSF center. And now she's a Science and Technology Policy Fellow in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to hand over the virtual mic to Sarah to let us know a little bit more about her background and what she does now.
Thanks,
Sarah.
Chandrima and Chris. Thank you so much for having me. Before we get started, I just want to offer a few disclaimers. So I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, and my views, thoughts, and experiences are my own. They should not be taken as representative of Congresswoman Dean, the Biophysical Society, AAAS, the AAAS journals, or any of my former employers. So now that that's out of the way, I'm happy to talk a little bit about my career. So it's been a winding road. Since basically high school, I've been interested in the intersection of science and policy. I did competitive policy debate as a high schooler. I continued to be involved as I went to college and studied biochemistry. And in college, I was part of the Lyman Briggs College at Michigan State University, which was founded with the express purpose of training scientists who can reflect on the intersection of science and society. And so I think sort of from the outset, I was always interested in sort of this in-between space between science and the policy that shapes it. So I went to graduate school, and once I got settled in the lab, I started exploring everything that Yale had to offer. And I was really fortunate to be in a place where public service was valued and was a really common career trajectory for folks. And so there were a lot of lectures and opportunities and student groups related to that. I joined and eventually led the Yale Science Diplomats, which is a science policy student group. I got involved in student government. I took classes in the law school. I went to lectures and coffees and all these other opportunities to really engage not only with preeminent scientists, but also with folks who were doing a lot in the government and policy sphere. And I took a bit of a detour. I think everyone around me would have assumed that I would move straight from Yale to policy in DC. But after defending my thesis, I had a little bit of free time before any of these fellowships would start. And I decided to take a pretty interesting position in the chemistry department. So I was split between being the managing editor of the editor-in-chief's office, or coordinating editor of the editor-in-chief's office of biochemistry. So I got to see the inside of the journal process. I got to really zoom out from my sort of hyper-focused PhD and see, everything that was going on in the field of biochemistry. And I also got to manage this nascent NSF Center grant and learn a lot about grants management and program development. When the opportunity came to move to Berkeley with sort of my boss and see CGEM through to this $20 million scale NSF Center, I decided to take it because I was still learning so much more about the other side of science. I think as graduate students, we see grants as sort of the thing that pays our salary and the thing that allows us to buy stuff. But to really see the back end and understand how policies shape the way that we do science was super valuable for me. And I was still learning a lot. And so this summer, I came to DC to do a congressional science fellowship with a much better understanding, I think, of the nuances of science policy. So I'm currently a Biophysical Society AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, and I serve in the House of Representatives in Congresswoman Madeleine Dean's office. So she's the representative for the 4th District of Pennsylvania, and I joined the office at the end of September.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's been like a pretty rich road. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just, yeah, that's a really interesting storyline so far. And so federal funding is obviously a big part where science policy intersects with the science. And so sort of you talked about getting that broad perspective. So what are some of the things that you sort of learned from that experience that you now can take forward with you?
Yeah, I think one of the big things was just how much more there is to a grant than just the direct costs. And so I never thought it would be super relevant to my policy experience, but it is really a conversation that's happening here in DC about like how, should we attribute indirect costs? Is the model that we have now the right model? And I
Yeah.
think as a graduate student, I probably couldn't have told you what an indirect cost was. I had no
Right.
idea, what the percentages were, how it worked out in the grants. But being on the other side and being the person who put together the budget and sort of got to learn how different things contribute to different cost categories and things like that, I feel like I have a much better understanding of it now than I did then. And that really allows me to sort of dive into these policy conversations as a bit more of an expert.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine.
Yeah, I guess like, starting as the managing director or executive director and then managing director of an NSF center straight from grad school, like how did you build the skills and experience you need to like manage such a center? Like you mentioned, as graduate students, we have no idea how grants work outside of our salaries. How did you like figure out how to work this?
Yeah, I think I was lucky that there were a lot of supports out there. And so both the Yale Office of Sponsored Projects and then the Berkeley Office of Sponsored Projects were, eager to help me understand what was going on. I did a lot of reading, and just a lot of sort of, curiosity driven learning in the same way that you do in grad school, just maybe on a what other people might think is a kind of boring topic.
Mhm.
Um, so, and it's a lot of trial and error and experience and putting together a budget and someone saying that's not correct. You need to do it this way. Um, and yeah, I think, people shouldn't be afraid to just jump in and try stuff. And I think that that's something that I learned in grad school that I really carried with me.
Right.
That's very, you mentioned that, you took a lot of different classes, you were involved in a lot of like law school activities, coffee chats, things like that. What were some avenues you pursued to develop your leadership skills during grad school that like helped you later in your career?
Yeah, I think getting involved in extracurricular activities helped a lot. So I eventually led our science policy group, and I was also involved in student government. And so in 2017, when the GOP proposed a tax bill that would have taxed graduate student tuition as income, which is would have, catapulted us into different tax brackets and really taken a lot of money that, folks didn't have. I was positioned in the right space to be able to sort of lead the efforts on campus to organize folks against that provision in the bill. And so, I knew I'd done a lot of policy work through the science diplomats. I was connected to other students at the university through student government. We were connected to the administration. And so that really put me in a position where I was able to take the lead on, what was a very intense couple of weeks, but was a really nice sort of experience in advocacy and shaping policy.
So
Yeah.
I want to come back to your current role.
Mm-hmm.
So I think many of us outside of DC know about what happens with the federal government, particularly in Congress, from the soap opera that we watch on TV. And I imagine that that's not really always a true picture of what happens there on a day-to-day basis. So maybe you can shed a little light on sort of what your day-to-day is like and how it differs from the television show.
Yeah, I am scarcely near a TV camera. My life, I think, is very different than what you all see on TV. And I know that everyone says this in every career chat, but it does depend from week to week. And so, in general, I'm always reading to keep up on issues in my portfolio. I'm always talking to other people who work on similar issues, both, in the House and Senate, but also folks at think tanks and organizations outside of the government to really make sure that I understand these issues, that I'm keeping track of what is on the top of people's minds. And I'm always looking for opportunities where a bill or some oversight or something like that might be able to make a tangible difference in these areas. And then when the House is in session, on top of sort of all of that background work, I'm also focusing on which bills are coming to the floor in my issue areas. Do I understand these? Can I answer questions about them? Do I have a recommendation on which way my boss should vote? And then if she's going to meetings or hearings or bill markups in my issue areas, I'm staffing her at those events as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like in many ways there's still quite a bit of research in your job.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so one thing, I've certainly, and I know some of the trainees have, everyone's heard of the AAAS fellowship, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that program, what's involved, And then the other question that we had was, is that the only avenue in? You hear about a lot of people that are in this that go through that particular fellowship, but is that the only avenue into a career like this?
Yeah, I would say that the AAAS fellowship is probably the most frequent way that folks transition to science policy, but it's definitely not the only way.
Yeah.
The fellowship is over 50 years old. There's thousands of folks that have gone through it. The alumni network is huge. And it's
Mm,
really a nice and supportive way, I think, to make the transition. And so there's a cohort of, several dozen congressional fellows that are all going through orientation at the same time. If you didn't have a ton of experience, if you have a lot of interest, but you haven't sort of engaged in policy work before, the orientation will prep you about how the government works, how, appropriations process works, and give you a lot of skills to transition from the bench to a more sort of social relationship built enterprise in DC.
mhm.
And I think the AAAS fellowship can be really useful in sort of getting your foot in the door because we, at least on the congressional side, are free for the offices. So our salaries are paid by AAAS or another organization. And so you sort of get to do all of the work of a legislative assistant. But because we didn't have the traditional policy career path, it would be a little bit tricky to get hired, I think, for a job with that title, just like right out of grad school, because you haven't like sort of gone through the process. We have a lot of skills, but maybe not a lot of practice applying them in a
Yeah.
policy context. So I definitely recommend the fellowship programs. There's AAAS, there's the Mirzayan Fellowship at the National Academies. There are, other societies have kind of their own small fellowships, but it can be a nice way to transition and you get to make the move with a cohort. So there are other folks that are going through the same thing you are. And it's a
Mm.
really supportive sort of collegial environment.
Yeah. You're talking quite a bit about this AAAS Science Policy Fellowship and like getting the necessary skills to get into this program. What advice do you have for grad students or postdocs to make their portfolio competitive for such a fellowship program?
Yeah, I always encourage folks to think about what they want to do next early and often in grad school. I think a lot of times people get very focused on their thesis project and sort of meeting all of those milestones without thinking about what they want to do next and how they're building skills to support that. And so I knew pretty early on that this was a fellowship that I was interested in pursuing. And I was able to sort of watch older students go through the interview process and, see what they had done, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. And there's no one formula that'll work for everyone. Like I got involved in a lot of policy and advocacy stuff. Other folks have done a lot of science communication. There are folks who run for office. Like there's a really wide breadth of folks who come into the program. But all of us have kind of, followed our passions and made sure that we're doing things away from the bench that resonate with ourselves and our values. Um, so that we are prepared for this next step. And one of the great things about ASBMB is that they have a summer externship, the advocacy training program, where
Mm.
you can get the skills and support to conduct a science policy project over the summer. And so for folks listening to this podcast, that might be something that you can do that'll sort of give you the tangible experience to apply for a fellowship like this.
That's awesome. One of the other things you also did, kind of building your portfolio here, was working as a scientific conference coordinator for 314 Action. What is 314 Action?
Yeah, 314 Action is an organization that recruits, trains, and supports scientists who are running for office. And so I got involved or connected with them initially when I worked on the campaign of a Yale faculty member who'd been running for Connecticut State Senate while I was in grad school. And then, sort of after grad school, I started organizing these conference sessions for the organization. And I specifically worked for 314 Education Fund, which is the part that focuses on recruitment and training. So we recognize that like scientists bring a lot of valuable skills to public office, but the things that we're good at and the things that we know how to do are not necessarily the same thing that you need to mount a successful campaign. Like we're very good at writing grants, but perhaps not as good at directly asking people we know for money. Or, we're very good communicators, but scientists communicate in a very scientist way that doesn't always resonate with members of the public. And so 314 Action is there just to sort of help folks make that transition and, gain those skills to mount a successful campaign.
That's really cool. And you personally have developed like multiple conference sessions and webinars to educate scientists about how to do this and how to serve in office. Um, Through your experience working on these conference sessions and webinars, what are some misconceptions that prevent scientists from getting into these things? What are some things you wish scientists understood about how the political processes actually work?
Yeah, I think as scientists, we're not always comfortable doing something until we know every single thing about it and every single thing that could go wrong. And I think sometimes you just need to jump in and give it a try. And I think that's something that I've learned talking to a lot of folks who've successfully done it. There's a webinar somewhere on the ASBMB website with a couple of biochemists who are serving at different levels of public office. And really, watching them go through that taught me that uh, you just need to sort of find your passions, find what you care about, and get involved, and you'll figure it out on the way. Like there's plenty of people there to support you, um, and you don't have to be sort of perfectly trained 100% out of the gate. And then the other misconception is that there, for a while, was sort of a persistent myth that scientists are like neutral arbiters of truth, and any sort of political activity like poisons their neutrality. And I think these folks are maybe conflating science with scientists. Like all of us have perspectives and points of view that we bring into any space. And so I think that, you know, folks shouldn't be worried about that and use that as an excuse not to explore running for office or serving on a local committee. There are lots of different ways to get involved in your community.
We are regular human beings, despite the stereotypes. Yeah, yeah. So getting into this idea of sort of jumping in and not being afraid of doing things that you don't feel perfectly comfortable with, it is a transition because as a researcher, whether in your PhD program or a postdoc, you are training to become sort of the world's leading expert on one area, and you'll know everything and more than anybody else, and that's not what you're talking about, right? And so picking up on that theme, the one thing that I noticed about the portfolio of work that you're doing, it seems like it's an everything but biochemistry, which is where you trained. And so how do you handle that challenge?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most fun parts of the job for me. Instead of needing to know everything, I have to know exactly what I need to know to make a decision and how to get that information. So sometimes I have the luxury of time to really dig in and learn. And, I'm listening to like energy podcasts in my free time to sort of
Uh,
bulk up on my energy background. But sometimes I'm working on a really short timeline and I need to focus pretty narrowly on like the decision relevant information. And I think grad school trains us really well for that. Like, I think sometimes people don't know when to stop in grad school and they just keep learning and learning and learning. But, like, we're all sort of confronted with information that's new and we need to process and decide what to do about it all the time in grad school. It's just a slightly different set of literature and, types of information that I'm processing.
yeah.
And actually, one of the most valuable things is the Congressional Research Service, which everyone can access. And they are nonpartisan subject matter experts that write these really nice reports that sort of focus on the policy of an issue area. And so, for scientists that are interested in a career like this, I'd recommend just sort of searching up your favorite science topic and seeing what they have to say about it.
Hmm.
There's a good report on like synthetic biology that came out a few years ago, for example.
And who does that work? Who is
Uh,
writing it?
Yeah, they're employed by the Library of Congress. They're just sort of Congressional Research Service subject matter experts. A lot of them
Okay.
have PhDs. That's actually another policy career path that you could
Another
take.
avenue, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a transition to what I wanted to ask you next, which was, I think most trainees understand what an academic job looks like and what the progression of that career looks like from seeing their advisors as they progress through the academic system. But for someone like you in the position that you're in, sort of what does your career trajectory look like? Where does that go for you?
Yeah, I am curious myself where this goes for me. I definitely think there's a lot of things that folks do
Yeah.
after working in Congress. Some folks stay on the Hill for a while. A lot of folks, move to advocacy organizations like ASBMB, for example, or AAAS. Some folks move to university government affairs positions. Some folks in this fellowship even go back and become academics. So, really, the world
Right.
is your oyster, I think, after something like this. And I'm
Absolutely.
definitely enjoying the Hill and looking forward to sort of staying in this ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about transitions and like you've made a lot of transitions throughout your career. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced while you were making these various transitions? Like, what did you learn from that when you moved through your career path?
Yeah, I think I learned that I can do more than I thought was possible. Like I never would have assumed coming out of grad school, no one around me would have assumed that I'd be contributing to like giant $20 million NSF grants. Like that was just not going to be my journey. But I think that, just being open to things and sort of pursuing things that interest you, even if they're not necessarily like the direct straight line to what you want to be when you grow up, can be really valuable. And so I think that's made me a lot more open now to doing different things that I, might not see a direct outcome of, but I'm interested in.
Hmm. And I guess what were some of the challenges that you faced along the way?
Yeah, I think, learning something new is always difficult. Sort of figuring out where your resources are, especially as we moved from Yale to Berkeley and had to sort of write a giant grant without having a
Mm.
ton of familiarity with the institution. But that's just an opportunity to explore and talk to people and learn things. And I think being an academic staff member was a much more difficult transition than this most recent like policy transition, just because I didn't have a cohort of other people that were going through it with me. And so I
Hmm.
think being able to sort of find your community, which I eventually did, but certainly not as early as I would have liked, um, at Berkeley, like really, helps you be more effective at your job. It helps you feel, better about what you do know, what you don't know, and really are a source of support. And so I think that's made this policy transition much easier, just knowing that there's like 35 other people going through the same thing.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something people realize after they finish their grad school or postdoc. When you're starting grad school, you have an automatic cohort of peers, and sometimes you have that in your postdoc as well. But when you go into something like, academic stuff where you don't start with a cohort, how do you go about like intentionally building your network at a new place? You mentioned you moved from Yale to Berkeley, huh? And as far as I remember, that was just before the pandemic started, right?
It
How
was.
did you kind of navigate that situation?
Yeah, not the easiest or most ideal time to be making new friends, but I think the fact that, we had tasks to do right away really helped. And so, the initial networking was just like, I need to know how to do this. Please teach me. At various points, I just sort of found people with job titles that sounded interesting or, past experiences that sounded interesting and started reaching out to them. And it really, I think at big institutions, sometimes folks get a little bit siloed and lost. And so I think being able to like create friendships across divisions or whatever can be really helpful, not only for your personal life, but also sort of professionally.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sort of sharing some of the thought processes that you went through as a grad student. You'd mentioned earlier that you were interested as early as high school in policy, um, but you went into a PhD. I mean, did you go into your PhD with sort of like, I know I'm heading off to a policy career, or this was just an interest that was always kind of there in the background and opportunities kept coming up? And how often did you have some of the same doubts about which direction do I want to go in as a student? And how did that influence some of the decisions you make about how to spend your time in graduate school? Because it's a challenge
Yeah,
a lot of trainees face, right? Is sort of like, they're away from the bench. Am I doing stuff that's useful or not? Is this a career maybe? Or, those thought processes. I think it's helpful to
yeah,
hear different people's stories.
definitely. So I, as early as high school, knew that policy was a thing. Even in college, actually, one of my professors had done a AAAS fellowship, although I didn't
Oh, okay.
know it by that name at the time. I just knew that he left for a year and then he came back.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like doing research was something that I enjoyed when I was doing it. I did some summer research at the University of Michigan under Janet Smith, who is still the like director of a beamline at the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Lab. And so I saw her sort of being a faculty member, but also, running this large like national resource and getting involved in sort of the stewardship of that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like maybe I could be like her one day, and I still would like to be like her one day. Um, and then I went to grad school. I was still enjoying structural biology, but I sort of knew that the issues that kept me up at night like weren't science related.
Mhm.
Um, and I enjoyed what I was doing. I enjoyed the people I was doing it with. And so I think I, knew that I was going to see the PhD through to the end, although I know a lot of people sort of face doubts, especially if they want to go away from the bench in that process.
Mm-hmm.
But truly, the fact that the AAAS fellowship required a PhD was a strong motivator to finish. And just knowing that, like, the things that I was doing outside of the lab had value for me and the community, even if, that may not have been immediately legible to folks on my committee, was helpful as well. And I was lucky that folks were pretty supportive of me, exploring and using my time for different things. There were a couple of cases where, like, I needed a landline to take a radio interview with NPR, and I had to kick my boss out of his office so that I could use his phone. And he was very supportive of that. So,
Oh, that's great.
I think, yeah, not everyone is fortunate enough to sort of be able to openly do that sort of stuff in grad school, but I feel quite lucky that I was.
Well, I mean, you must have had something to do with that. I mean, how did you approach that subject with your PI, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I think I printed off a couple of articles like I'd found, from pipettes to policy, like someone's description of their career path, just because I knew that this wasn't really something that he'd been exposed to before. Like none of our lab
Mm-hmm.
alumni had done stuff like this. Very few
Mm-hmm.
people in the department were doing stuff like this. And so I wanted to make sure that like it's some idea of what it was. And then I really just made sure that I was like keeping my commitments to folks in the lab. Like if I, was going to help out with this experiment or mentor this undergrad, like all of that stuff was getting done. And then I was also able to do other things on top of it. And
Yeah, of
like, I don't know, in biochemistry, there's incubations, there's like there's time to do other stuff if you kind of
course.
plan and manage. And so that I did a lot of that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of been like eyes on the goal the whole time for you, which is amazing. And you did mention that you loved everything you did about policy throughout grad school and what you're doing now. But what is like one thing that keeps you going to work every day? What is one thing you love about being in the policy space?
Yeah, I mean, these days I just can't believe that I go to work, at the building right next to the United States Capitol every day. Like that's such a sort of honor and a privilege to be able to do. And I think just, going into work and hearing from constituents and hearing from other folks about the challenges they face and feeling like we're really in a position to do something about it, like keeps me going in a way that was not always as legible at other jobs.
Yeah, can I ask a quick,
Yeah.
how many people are there like you working in each congressional office? Is there a team of people
Ooh.
or is it just
Yeah, there's like probably less than one fellow per office, at least on the House side. And offices in the House of Representatives tend to be pretty small. So, like, there may be 8 to 10 people, and maybe like three of those are policy and legislative staff. There's also folks who do communications and scheduling and the front desk and things like that. Senate offices are a bit bigger, and so they'll tend to have, maybe 10 different policy experts and a couple of different fellows within that group. So in the Senate side, folks tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused,
yeah.
but it's still a really sort of small group of people in each office that are driving this.
So that office really relies on you. I mean, that's an obvious statement, but my point is, you are it. You are the voice on some of these issues.
Yeah, it's a little intimidating at first, but definitely getting more comfortable in that space.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, that's fantastic. That's very cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, like you mentioned, I feel like there are very few jobs where you can see that you're in a position to actually help an issue and like solve people's problems quite directly like that. Kind of on the flip side of what you love about the job, what are some things that might not be so great about working in policy? What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think the one sort of obvious thing is that your career prospects in policy tend to be pretty tied to what's going on electorally, who's in the White House, what they are doing, things like that. And so that can cause a little bit of stress, but also opportunities. And so, each election cycle, jobs can open up in theory, or they could also go away. But there tends to be like kind of a bit more, I think, mixing than there is in sort of the academia or more traditional science jobs.
Yeah. So the policy, the fellowship is for how long? How long is that?
Just 1 year.
It's a 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. But you say some people will end up staying on at the Hill afterwards. So
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Because essentially now that office has to replace you if you leave. So that I can imagine they've grown quite dependent on you.
Maybe, but there'll be another
Hopefully,
crop of fellows next year.
there'll be
So
another crop of fellows.
hopefully.
Well, yeah, I suppose that's true. I suppose that's true. So can you tell us, going back to your grad school days again, um, were there certain sort of skills in yourself that you recognized or strengths that you recognized that now you look back and you say, yeah, that makes sense. I'm doing what I'm doing now. These are things that I've sort of, if I'm being honest with myself, I feel like I are strengths of mine.
Yeah, I think sort of I had a little trouble in grad school focusing and like wanting to learn more about one single issue because for me it just like I wanted to learn about everything. And so I think now it makes sense that I have a huge portfolio where I'm learning about everything in a slightly less
Yeah.
deep way. And there was the day that I dragged everyone to Anthony Fauci's talk at the medical school. This was like pre-COVID. They didn't know who he was. I was like, no, this guy's a big deal. Like, we got to go see him.
Yeah,
And that all makes sense.
yeah. Very good.
That's awesome. One other aspect I kind of want to dive into is a little bit about your work in science communication. Like while working with you, I've seen how passionate you were about getting people educated about science communication, how passionate you were about doing it yourself. So I guess my question is two parts. One is, what is some advice you have for scientists or trainees about how to improve their science communication skills? And
Mhm.
the other part of it is how has this experience in working in communication been helpful for you in your present job? Because I feel like that's basically what you do, just by a different name.
Yeah, passionate is a really nice word for it, Chandrima. Thank you. I think science communication is important for everyone, regardless of what sort of path you're taking or what career you're doing. And in my experience, and I guess the literature also sort of bears this out, that it helps to sort of meet folks where they are and to know who your audience is. And so I think a lot of times there are incentives to sort of do the biggest, broadest, most impactful possible thing that you can. But if you do something huge and you don't, you reach 10,000 people, but you don't really have conversations with them, it's pretty unlikely that you're really going to change hearts and minds or, teach people very much about an issue. And so I think some of the most impactful things I've been a part of have been, smaller scale, really tailored to the community that they're aiming to reach. In graduate school, we did something called a flipped science fair, where we had graduate students and postdocs present really simplified versions of their research posters to middle schoolers who acted as the judges. And so I think, that was intended to sort of flip the normal hierarchy that you see in science communication and give the kids a little bit more agency over sort of engaging with the science communication and being able to judge people, which I think is always fun. Um,
Well, and forcing the scientists to speak at a level that can be comprehended, right?
yeah, and folks brought those posters to Capitol Hill. They brought those posters to their departmental retreats so that they could have what turned out to be better conversations with people
Right.
within their department in a different area. Like, I think sometimes we view science communication as extra, but really like being able to explain what you do to anyone is a useful skill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess as we're coming to the closing end of this podcast, there's this one question I always like to ask all of our guests. And I think it's useful for the trainees to listen to as well. If you had a way to meet your younger self, maybe when you were finishing up undergrad or starting out grad school, what is one thing you'd like to tell her about how her career will play out?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to choose to talk to my freshman self in college. And so at this point, I was choosing between two summer internships. And so one was to go to University of Michigan and do structural biology. And the other, shockingly, was to go to DC and do a policy internship for the summer. And so I think, I agonized a little bit over this choice, but I think I would go back and tell myself, like, both options are totally valid. You can't make a wrong choice. Like, you'll just make your way back to the beginning anyway.
Wow.
So I think it's a little funny that I've done a loop and I'm now sort of taking the other path with a whole PhD and a bunch of work experience under my belt.
Yeah. You got to do both in the end, so it worked out.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been a lot of fun learning about your career and this career field in general. For those of you who'd like to continue the conversation about this or any of our other topics, you can visit the ASB MB Active site. where you can leave comments, you can ask questions, and you can make suggestions for future episodes. So thank you very much. Good to see you all again. And till next time.
Bye.